Hello, Year 9. So as mentioned in the email, we're going to be moving to one video lesson a week and then one learning clinic, which is going to be on Wednesday at 9:30. You should have already got a Teams invitation from me, and that is an opportunity that if you have any questions about any of the work that has been set during lockdown, or any specific questions about the video for this week, then you can come into that clinic, join that clinic and ask me those questions, okay? But as I said in the email, please do only join those sessions if you need help and if you need support, because obviously if I have 100 of you in the session, as lovely as that would be, that's going to be slightly more tricky if some of you are just desperate to speak to me live, she says with irony, rather than because you need some help and some support. So this week we're going to be looking at another one of the war poems called A Wife in London, okay, by Thomas Hardy. But first of all, we're going to look at some vocabulary, which is all old vocabulary, okay? These are all words that you might have heard or should have heard before, but don't worry, we'll be revising the definitions as well. So onomatopoeia then. Think to yourself, what might onomatopoeia be? So onomatopoeia is when a word imitates a sound. So how is the following quotation onomatopoeic? A messenger knock cracks smartly. So think to yourself, what is onomatopoeic about that word? Then we have pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy is when the weather is used to create a mood and an atmosphere. So what atmosphere might a poet create by using pathetic fallacy of fog in a poem? So think about what fog, what mood and atmosphere does fog create? And then finally, the word melancholy. Now, melancholy means sadness. Now, think about Dulce et Decorum Est, the poem about the gas attack. Would you describe it as a melancholy poem? And again, explain your answer or your sort of view. So the onomatopoeic phrase is cracks. The messenger knock cracks smartly. So this is someone knocking at the door. So that, you know, that word cracks, it's quite an abrupt, quite a jarring, shocking sound. And that's actually from the poem we're going to look at today. So we'll explore the effect of that onomatopoeia a little bit later on. And again, fog. Fog is the weather used in this poem, in the pathetic fallacy of this poem. So fog often creates quite a dark, negative, haunting or depressing atmosphere. And again, we'll see how that is used in the poem and the effect of that. Now, this final question is a little bit of a tricky one because there's not really a right answer. You could argue that Dulce et Decorum Est is a melancholy poem because it is sad. It's a sad poem about the fact that these men are being slaughtered. But you could also argue that it's not so much melancholic as it is angry, as it is shocking and gruesome. So again, if you said, yes, I think it is melancholic, or if you said, no, it's not, then you're both right, because there's multiple ways of interpreting it. You know, on one level, it's sad because it's about death, but on another level, it's more sad, angry, confrontational to the people at home, maybe necessarily rather than something that is sad. So today we're going to analyse Hardy's use of language in A Wife in London. So by the end of the lesson, you'll know the context of the poem, how to identify meta language in the poem, how Hardy uses language to create effects, Hardy's intentions, and the themes that Hardy explores. So the first thing we're going to have a little think about before we look at the poem is I'm going to read to you, and it's over 2 slides, an extract written in 1880 about the London fog. Okay, and I just want you to think about, as I read it to you, the imagery that you get of the description of this London fog. A London fog is brown, reddish yellow or greenish. darkens more than a white fog, has a smoky or sulphurous smell, is often somewhat drier than a country fog, and produces, when thick, a choking sensation. Instead of diminishing while the sun rises higher, it often increases in density, and some of the most lowering London fogs occur about midday or late in the afternoon. Sometimes the brown masses rise and interpose a thick curtain at a considerable elevation between earth and sky. A white cloth spread out on the ground rapidly turns dirty, and particles, when I'm doing these lessons, there's a great big bar across that last bit. So you're just going to have to read those last 3 lines because it is completely obscured on my screen. Such of our readers as have never been in London in November can scarcely imagine what it is to grope their way through a downright thorough London fog. It is sometimes like being embedded in a dilution of yellow peas pudding, just thick enough to get through it without being wholly choked or completely suffocated. You can see through the yard of it, which at the next stride you are doomed to swallow, and that is all. It is a kind of meat and drink, and a very sorry sustenance for those who are asthmatical, as you may tell by hearing one old cough answer another. Sorry, yet again, this is, there we go. By hearing one old cough answering to another from opposite sides of the street, and which, although you cannot see the passengers, you can tell from their grumbling that they do not like the something at all. Sorry about that. You will be able to see the sides properly, but the bits at the very bottom, like I said, are obscured by my taskbar on this software. So think about then the imagery that we get of this fog. It is thick, it is disgusting, it chokes you, makes you feel like you're suffocating, it makes you anxious because you can't see through it properly. So what we have here is this fog creating some very negative, very dark, quite frightening or maybe even dangerous images in our head. And we'll see in a minute how this links to A Wife in London. So we're going to spend the next couple of slides just thinking about the context of the poem, okay? So either on your copy of the poem or on a separate piece of paper, you might want to write the word context and make some notes now. So there were 2 Bow Awards, one in 1880 to 1881 and the second in 1899 to 1902, both between the British and the settlers of Dutch origin called Boer Afrikaners or Voortrekkers in South Africa that put an end to the 2 independent republics that the settlers had founded. So what we need to remember, and this is scarily relevant actually to everything that's going on in all the protests at the moment, is that Britain colonised huge areas of the world, and whilst they were different countries, we essentially seized and claimed those territories as our own, and any resources that happened to be on that land we claimed as our own. Any of the people that happened to live in that land before we claimed it had to sort of put up with it, really. So the Boer Wars, as you can see, came before World War I. So we can see that Thomas Hardy's A Wife in London is the earliest war poem that we look at because it comes before Dulce et Decorum Est and the Soldier, which were written about World War I. Then obviously Mamet's Wood and The Manhunt are contemporary poems. So Thomas Hardy's is the oldest and its focus is on the Boer War. So the conflict was over the huge gold reserves in the Transvaal. So what we can see here is that actually, again, the British people essentially wanted the gold on this land. The British eventually had 400,000 men in South Africa. The Boers at their peak had 52,000, using boys as young as 9. So just let those numbers sink in a minute. So this is a war essentially because they want the gold that's on this land. The British Army had 400,000 men, trained soldiers. The Boers at their biggest had 52,000 people and used boys as young as 9. And you can imagine, and hopefully your reaction is, that is pretty horrific. In addition, the Boers were mostly untrained farmers fighting what was perhaps the greatest power in the world. So the match was uneven from the start. So again, you have this huge trained army versus boys and farmers who are grossly outnumbered. This isn't a war because people are being oppressed. This isn't a war to overthrow a dictator or save people. This is a war based on the British wanting to expand their power base and having more money, and colonialism and what the British people and Europeans, it wasn't just Britain, it was European countries. Really, really interesting to go away and do your own research about colonialism and actually think about and realise some of the atrocious things that our country and many others did during these times. We were forced, or did give these territories back mostly, eventually, but not after or not before committing some really horrendous acts against these people and against these territories. So that's our sort of context, really, that it's the war that it's focused on in A Wife in London is the Second Boer War. The war eventually ended in May 1902 when the last of the Boers surrendered. 22,000 British troops and over 25,000 Boer civilians had died in the conflict. So we can just see what a huge waste of life on both sides that it was. So before we think about and learn a little bit more about Thomas Hardy himself, we're going to think about tragedy and irony. Now, if you want to, you could pause this video and use your mobile phone or your computer to actually look up the definitions of tragedy and irony. So tragedy, if something is a tragedy, like say a play like Romeo and Juliet, it is something sad or tragic or negative that has happened. Now, irony is slightly harder to define, really. You know, irony is essentially something very, I don't know, darkly humorous in a way. There's a great 90s song by an artist called Alanis Morissette called Ironic, where actually if you are in any way confused about irony, that is a good song to listen to. So when you look at the actual definition of irony, a state of affairs or an event that seems deliberately contrary to what one expects and is often wryly amusing as a result. So irony is when something unexpected happens, which can sometimes be wryly or darkly humorous. But irony, again, is sometimes tragic as opposed to darkly humorous. So you'll see in a minute when we look at the poem that it is divided into two sections, tragedy, and then the second section is irony. We're going to look at that in a minute. So Thomas Hardy himself then, he was a very famous novelist. Okay, he wrote a lot of novels at the time, so he was a famous writer. So he wrote the poem 2 months after the start of the Boer War. He was a known pacifist and therefore did not approve of war. Now, a pacifist is someone who believes there shouldn't be war. No war, no fight, no conflict. So he was someone that didn't approve of war anyway, But imagine how someone like him would feel about something as atrocious as the Boer War, you know, how selfish the war was, really, how unfair, how unequal. So you can imagine that he would be pretty horrified that it was happening at all. He particularly didn't approve of the Boer War, as he felt it was wrong of the British to go to war just because of the gold mines in the country. So again, he thought that this particular war was horrendous because it was motivated by greed and nothing else. So in this poem, a wife is waiting at home in London for news of her husband, who is fighting in the Boer War in South Africa. Fog is filling the London streets when there is a knock at the door and a messenger arrives with news of her husband. And that's where we're going to start looking at the poem. Now, like yesterday, I said this week we were going to annotate it via PowerPoint. But as I've said to you yesterday as well, if you find you prefer seeing me handwrite it, then I'm happy to switch to doing that. I just thought I'd do something a bit different this week. So we can see section 1, the tragedy. Now, as always, we think about the title as well, and notice that it's called A Wife in London. And we can infer from this then that the poem is going to focus on the wife's perspective. And actually, we get very little war in this poem, apart from the fact that she is waiting of news of her husband who is fighting in a war. Like the manhunt, this poem doesn't just focus on war, it also focuses on love and relationships, and it focuses on loss. But it's again quite a domestic poem, focusing on this wife left in London, desperately waiting for news of her husband. So, section 1, the tragedy. She sits in the tawny vapour that the city lanes have uprolled. Now, tawny means brown, and vapour is linking to the fog. So suddenly it makes a little bit more sense why I was going on about the fog a few slides ago. So you've got to imagine this woman sitting by herself in a small, old little house in one of the many winding, narrow alleys of London. And anyone, I'm sure most of you have been to London, will know that yes, you've got the main roads, but then you have all of these narrow little alleys. And what Thomas Hardy is doing is he's making us picture this brown fog rolling through the lanes. So if she were to look out of her window, she would hardly see anyone around her or anything around her, even the building opposite. She would just see this thick brown fog. So there's a real sense of isolation here, her isolation. This fog is almost cutting her off from anyone else. And she's just by herself with her anxiety and her concern, wondering how her husband is fighting off in the Boer War. So she sits in the tawny vapour that the city lanes have uprolled, behind whose webby fold on fold, like a waning taper, the street lamp glimmers cold. So the webby fold on fold is again the fog. So behind this fog, she can just make out the glimmer of a street lamp. But it's how Thomas Hardy describes this street lamp that is significant. So firstly, he describes the light as cold. So again, this is linking to this very negative mood and atmosphere. It's not a warm, welcoming glow. It's a cold, harsh glow. Again, emphasizing this sense of sadness, anxiety, and isolation that she's feeling. Then we have the simile, like a waning taper, the street lamp glimmers cold. Now, a taper is a long, thin candle, okay, that would, and again, before electricity or gas lighting, it was all candlelight, and you would light a series of candles by a very long, sort of thin candle. That's what a taper is. So a taper is essentially a long, thin candle. But that taper is waning. Now, waning means to get smaller. So like a candle that is getting smaller and smaller, this coldly glimmering street lamp is almost getting dimmer and dimmer. Now, this simile is a hopeless symbol that foreshadows death. Okay, the waning taper, this candle withering away and about to go out, is symbolizing what she's going to find out about her husband. And it, you know, wouldn't take a genius right now to foreshadow that she's likely going to receive news that her husband has died. And this simile is foreshadowing that. So now we have the second half of that first section. A messenger's knock cracks smartly. So again, we looked at cracks is our onomatopoeia. So think about the mood and atmosphere that's been set. Very isolated, and you know, that's the fog is pathetic fallacy. So do make sure you've written down by the vapor, the tawny vapor, that is pathetic fallacy. Thomas Hardy is using the fog to create very negative imagery of isolation. And what we have with that onomatopoeia, with cracks, is it's almost like we've been jolted awake, like she's been almost jolted probably out of her negative, anxious thoughts. So this, and also smartly, you know, that adverb, cracks smartly. It's not, doesn't mean cleverly, it means it's a very sharp, very crisp, clear sound. So, you know, that imagery there is as if she's being jolted almost out of her stupor or out of her thoughts. Flashed news is in her hand, of meaning it dazes to understand those shapes so shortly. Now, she basically finds out what this messenger has done is he has given her a telegram, okay, a letter. And the flashed news, the flashed is really interesting here because although she was waiting for news, it's like she wasn't prepared to have it so suddenly. But even though it's shaped so shortly, even though the letter's not very long, she dazes to understand. She can't understand, or she can't comprehend or understand or accept what this short letter is telling her. Now, can we see after the comma after smartly, we have the enjambment. Flashed news is in her hand, of meaning it dazes to understand those shapes so shortly. Now that enjambment here is probably, Hardy's probably used that to show how quickly her mind is reeling with this news. So that enjambment is really reflecting the fact that she can't understand what is happening after all of this time sitting, waiting by herself for news. Now that she's got the news, it's all happening too quickly. She can't understand it. So the enjambment is reflecting that. And then we have the colon after shortly, pausing. And then Hardy reveals what it says. He has fallen in the far south land. Now, he is obviously her husband. Has fallen is a euphemism, a respectful way of saying he's died in the far south land, South Africa, where he's fighting. Notice the caesura. Remember, caesura is when punctuation is used in the middle or end of a line. He, hyphen, has fallen, hyphen, in the far south land. That's really slowing down the pace in which we read what this letter is actually saying. And it really puts our emphasis on this euphemism that he's fallen, he's died. So think about the ellipsis after land. Ellipsis is the 3 dots. Why might Hardy have used ellipsis? Possibly he's used it because he wants to reflect for the reader the fact that the wife cannot wrap her head around, cannot understand or comprehend what's happened. That ellipsis could be reflecting her shock at what she's found out. So now we have the second section, okay? And again, it's called the irony. 'Tis the morrow, so it's the next day. The fog hangs thicker. So again, we have the pathetic fallacy. The fog is even worse. Now, what that pathetic fallacy could be doing is, no matter how tragic the letter she received yesterday was, today is going to be even worse for her. We could also interpret hangs as another reference to death as well. The postman nears and goes. So the postman has arrived now. And again, notice the caesura. We've got the pause of the semicolon, then the comma, then the colon. These little snippets of information. And then the enjambment. A letter is brought whose lines disclose by the firelight flicker his hand, whom the worm now knows. So she receives the next day a letter written by her husband before he died. So it's his handwriting. And whom the worm now knows is actually, this bit always reminds me of the blown and broken bird's egg of a skull in Mamet's Wood. The way actually on the surface it's not necessarily that horrific, but when you really think of the imagery, it is, you know, whom the worm now knows. That's making us picture his dead, rotting body in the ground, covered by worms, insects and maggots. So again, it's a very clever and subtle image there, but it's also a reminder, it's like he's written this from beyond the grave. He wrote it obviously before he died, and now just upon hearing news of his death, she's now reading this letter for the first time. So you can imagine the emotional impact of that. We also have the alliteration here of firelight flicker, which again is conveying a very powerful image of, you know, this sort of isolation. The only light, the only company she has is this sort of flicker of this firelight that she's reading this letter by. Fresh, firm, penned in highest feather. So the letter is fresh. It seems like it wasn't written that long ago. The handwriting is firm, strong, reminding us that this was a young, we don't know how young, but, you know, a young man in the prime of his life, strong, penned in highest feather. Now, this is likely referring to the fact that obviously they didn't have biros in those days. It's the ink, the feather of the inkwell that he would be writing with. So it's, you know, his best writing. He's tried to present this letter, knowing it's his only way of communicating with his wife, in a really fancy, really nice way. So then again, we have this pause after feather, page full of his hoped return. So what this letter contains is all of the things he wanted to do with her when he returns from war, and of home planned jaunts, of break and burn. Now, break and burn mean woods and streams. So this imagery of these them going on these lovely long country walks in the summer weather. So we can see that to probably keep his spirits up, to keep her spirits up, he'd really imagined all of the wonderful things they'd do once they were reunited. And, you know, walking in the sunshine by the woods and the stream in the summer weather, and of new love that they would learn. So it's as if their love would grow over time, and it's like it would be the new stage of their relationship. And think about the full stop This section ends with a full stop. The last section ended with the ellipsis, ... So again, that's really clever by Hardy, because that full stop is showing that's the end. It's not just the end of the poem, it's the end of their relationship, because he is dead. There will be no more relationship. There is no new love that they can learn, because war, a pointless and selfish war, has cost this man his life. And it's not just his suffering. This poem focuses on the suffering of the woman he left behind for this war that Hardy believed was selfish and pointless. So this poem is a fantastic one to compare to the Manhunt, and we're going to focus a bit on that in the next couple of lessons, because we can see that it's focusing on the wife, just like Laura in the Manhunt. We can see that it's talking about the effect war has had on their relationship, but the Manhunt ends with the possibility that their relationship can grow. In A Wife in London, there is no hope. And that full stop is really symbolising that. Okay, well done. So finally, we're just going to look at two last questions. So what is the effect of Hardy's use of pathetic fallacy at the start of the poem? So think about the effect of the fog. Why has he done it? And how does Hardy use language to create an atmosphere of melancholy in the poem? So how does he use language to create this mood and atmosphere of sadness, of melancholy? Okay, well done, and I will see you tomorrow.